The chandelier above the marble staircase shimmered like frozen starlight, yet the vast house below lay drenched in silence. Night pressed against the tall windows with the weight of a storm, wind clawing at glass, rain sliding down in endless rivers, and inside, one man sat alone. His name was Alexander, and though his name filled glossy magazines and real estate towers across the city bore his signature, the walls he returned to each evening knew nothing of laughter. They knew only the soft scrape of his fork against porcelain, the hollow click of shoes across polished stone, the muted rustle of newspapers unopened because no one cared to ask about the stories inside. This was success without warmth, wealth without healing, triumph without touch. And on this storm-driven night, as lightning licked the horizon like some restless promise, Alexander leaned back in his leather chair by the fire and felt the air tremble with something unfamiliar. Not the steady hush of flames, not the storm's distant howl, but a sound softer, stranger, like destiny wrapped in 3 quiet knocks. The first was almost a whisper, a timid plea pressed against oak. The second came steadier, trembling yet insistent. By the third, Alexander rose, slippered feet sinking into Persian rugs, the chandelier shadows chasing him down the hall. When he opened the door, the storm broke into the room like a beast untamed, and with it came a figure he had never expected. A young woman, rain-soaked, hair clinging to her cheeks, her small bag sagging with water, her lips trembling as though even words had abandoned her. Her eyes, those eyes, were wide pools of stormlight, uncertain whether to plead or to flee. For a heartbeat, he saw not a stranger, but a reflection of himself, alone against the downpour. Her voice, when it came, was softer than the rain. "Can I stay in your garage tonight?" The world tilted. A man who had signed contracts worth millions, who had built towers piercing clouds, stood stunned at a doorway by 7 words carried on a broken breath. He could have closed the door. He could have sent her away. Yet something stirred in the silence between them. An ache, a warmth long buried, a healing pulse he had not felt in decades. "No," he whispered, surprising himself with the softness of his own tone. "You belong inside." The words hung in the storm's mouth, fragile yet irrevocable. She blinked, rain sliding from her lashes like pearls of disbelief, then stepped into the golden spill of the foyer. The marble floor caught her dripping footsteps, and the house, once hollow, suddenly held the sound of another life. Alexander shut the door, muffling the roar outside, and in the quiet that followed, he felt something shift. The silence no longer pressed down on him. It listened. It waited. She hugged her bag close, the kind of embrace one gives not to possessions, but to memories, as though the world inside that worn fabric was the only anchor she had left. He noticed her shoes, muddy, too big, borrowed from some forgotten past. She looked impossibly small against the sweeping staircase, like a single flame flickering in a cathedral. He wanted to ask her name, but instead he said only, "Come closer. Let me get you warm." He led her toward the fire, draped a blanket across her shoulders. The fabric swallowed her, but in the glow of the flames her face softened, and he saw the delicate lines of someone who had carried too much, too young. She pressed her hands near the fire, and he remembered, with sudden sharpness, the sting of his own childhood winters, the nights when comfort was a dream always out of reach. Something inside him cracked, but not with pain, with recognition. In the air drifted the smell of cocoa, faint at first, then blooming rich as he stirred milk and sugar in a saucepan long untouched. She cupped the mug with both hands as though it were treasure, whispering a thank you that landed in his chest like a song. He watched her sip, her shoulders releasing a weight he could almost see, and he felt the healing warmth stretch into the corners of his house. It struck him then how easily one soul could shift another's silence. Her presence was like light slipping beneath a locked door. He found himself studying her eyes, not with the gaze of a host offering pity, but with the wonder of a man realizing his fortress had been waiting for a guest all along. And though neither spoke much in those first hours, the storm outside raged like an orchestra, their silence within threaded with something fragile and luminous. He saw her glance toward the backpack again and again, the way one touches a wound they hope no one notices. He understood without asking. Whatever lay inside it carried the story of why she had come. That night, Alexander realized he was no longer merely a man with wealth, but a man standing on the edge of something greater. An unraveling of walls, a beginning written by chance and rain, a doorway that once opened could never truly close. The storm outside had not passed, yet within his house another weather began to form, gentler, warmer, the kind that heals. If this story lingers in your heart, if the quiet spark of two lives colliding in the storm gives you even a small sense of warmth, I invite you to share that feeling. Leave a comment, whisper your thoughts into the world, subscribe so the journey continues beyond this night. Every touch of support, no matter how small, is a flame that keeps these healing stories alive. And as the rain pressed against the glass, and the young woman, wrapped in borrowed warmth, looked around the mansion with tentative eyes, Alexander felt the silence bend, ready to carry them toward the next chapter. The night was not an ending. It was the beginning of a story neither had dared to imagine. The fire hummed low, crackling softly as the storm pressed against the tall windows, its fury muted now by walls that seemed for the first time to hold more than emptiness. Alexander sat across from her, hands clasped loosely, studying the way her small frame disappeared into the blanket. She held the mug with careful reverence, blowing gently across its surface before sipping, each breath a visible tremor that softened as warmth spread through her. The glow of the flames painted her cheeks with color, faint yet alive, and in that fragile light she seemed both impossibly young and infinitely old, as though her eyes carried centuries of sleepless nights. He had built towers of glass, rooms gilded in marble, foyers meant to dazzle, yet none of them had ever known the simple grace of this moment, one soul thawing in the presence of another. She shifted, clutching the blanket tighter, and whispered her name. The syllables fell between them like the gentlest gift, and he found himself repeating it under his breath, not for memory's sake, but to anchor the sound in the hollow spaces inside him. It lingered there, filling a silence that for years had been nothing but echo. She told him little at first, her voice breaking off into pauses that weighed heavier than words. He did not rush her, sensing that questions were sharp instruments, and what she needed now was not dissection, but shelter. So he listened, letting the quiet hold them both, letting the healing rhythm of fire and storm loosen what sorrow had bound too tightly. At last, she confessed she had nowhere safe to sleep that night, nowhere she felt welcome, nowhere her body could rest without bracing for shouts or shadows. The simplicity of it struck him like a blade. This young woman, whose voice trembled with exhaustion, asking only for the corner of a garage when he had a house vast enough to swallow her sorrows whole. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, eyes steady, and told her she would not have to sleep in the cold again. Something in her face shifted then, fragile disbelief flickering into the smallest spark of hope. It was faint, but it glowed like a candle in wind, refusing to die. She opened the worn bag resting by her feet, hands hesitant, as though the contents were too intimate to expose. From it she pulled a stuffed rabbit, its fur faded, one ear nearly torn away, and a small notebook swollen with damp pages. She placed them gently on her lap, smoothing each crease as though restoring a universe that might collapse if left unattended. He noticed the way her hands trembled less when touching those objects, as though they were more than keepsakes, they were lifelines. The rabbit, she said, had been with her since childhood. The notebook held sketches of homes, small rooms with crooked windows, porches with flowers, kitchens filled with light. She drew them not because they existed, but because she needed to remember how they might. Alexander reached across the low table, careful not to touch, only resting his hand near hers, letting her know without words that he understood. She glanced up, eyes shimmering with something between grief and gratitude, and for a moment he felt the house breathe with them. As hours unfolded, she spoke of her mother, of nights spent waiting by doors that never opened until dawn, of shelters where voices rose too sharp, where footsteps carried more threat than comfort. She confessed how laughter felt like a memory slipping further away. Alexander listened, the storm's rhythm outside echoing her story, and he realized that wealth had not shielded him from a loneliness that mirrored hers. Two lives, distant as stars, had collided at his threshold, each carrying emptiness, each now finding warmth in the other's presence. The fire dwindled to embers, yet neither moved. He found himself remembering moments he had long buried, the sound of his mother's voice before she was gone, the way he once believed a house could be more than stone. And as he remembered, he saw her watching him with quiet recognition, as though she too sensed the hollowness he carried. It was not pity in her gaze, but something gentler, something healing, a shared knowing that pain could be lessened when carried together. When her eyelids grew heavy, he rose silently, lifting the blanket around her shoulders. She resisted at first, mumbling that she would sleep on the couch, but he guided her toward the guest room, the covers turned back, the lamp glowing softly. She lay down, clutching her rabbit, whispering words too faint to catch, and within moments her breathing steadied into rhythm. He stood in the doorway longer than he intended, watching the fragile peace settle across her face. Closing the door gently, he walked back through the silent halls, and for the first time in years the silence felt alive, filled not with emptiness but with presence. The storm had not ended, but something had begun. A thread of connection weaving its way through the cold marble, through the echo of rooms that had waited too long. As he returned to the fire, he knew with clarity that this night was no accident. It was a crossing of paths that would change everything, a gentle collision of loneliness transformed into belonging. And while the storm raged on, Alexander felt the healing warmth of possibility rise inside him, carrying both fear and promise, ready to follow them into the next dawn. Morning broke gently across the tall windows, golden light spilling over marble floors that had too long known only the cold reflection of chandeliers. Alexander rose earlier than usual, stirred not by the demands of business, but by the awareness that someone else now breathed beneath his roof. The silence he had carried for years had shifted into something softer, a stillness threaded with life. He walked down the hall, his steps uncharacteristically careful, and paused at the door of the guest room. Through the small gap, he saw her curled beneath the quilt, the stuffed rabbit pressed to her chest, her hair tangled across the pillow like a dark river. For the first time in years, he did not see emptiness in his home. He saw a story unfolding. When she stirred awake, her eyes blinked against the light, uncertain at first, as though she expected the storm to return or the walls to vanish. He greeted her softly, and she answered with a shy smile, one that looked almost foreign on her face, as though her lips had forgotten how to shape it. He guided her to the kitchen, where the smell of fresh coffee mingled with the unfamiliar rhythm of eggs sizzling in a pan. He had not cooked breakfast for anyone in decades, yet his hands remembered with surprising ease, guided not by habit, but by the quiet joy of preparing something for someone who mattered. She sat at the counter, her legs swinging above the polished floor, watching him with cautious fascination. When he set the plate before her, eggs warm, toast golden, and a glass of orange juice catching the morning light, she whispered a thank you so gentle it pierced him more deeply than any applause he had received in boardrooms. She ate slowly at first, almost afraid the food might vanish. Then, with hunger too long suppressed, yet always with manners, wiping her mouth, lifting her eyes after each bite, as if to ensure it was truly allowed. Alexander drank his coffee, not for taste, but to steady himself against the swell of tenderness rising in his chest. Between bites, she began to speak, voice hesitant at first, then stronger, as though each mouthful carried permission to release what she had held too long. She told him about a small home they once had, not luxurious, not grand, but theirs. She described the balcony with flowers her mother tended, the warmth of cookies on Sundays, the simple joy of feeling safe. Her words carried no bitterness, only longing, and when she whispered that the rent had risen and forced them out, Alexander felt his chest tighten with guilt. He had raised prices in countless buildings, thinking only of numbers, never of faces. And now here was one of those faces before him, fragile yet resilient, living proof of choices made far away in glass towers. She paused, fork trembling slightly, and admitted she had stopped telling classmates where she lived. Once she had trusted a friend, only to be mocked as the garage girl. The memory stung her voice, but she lifted her chin with quiet defiance, as though she refused to let shame define her. Alexander's throat ached as he listened, recognizing in her pain the echo of his own loneliness, the years he had hidden behind wealth, pretending silence was strength. He wanted to tell her she deserved more than survival, that her worth was not measured by clothes or addresses, but he knew words alone were fragile. So instead, he let his presence hold steady, offering her the healing gift of being seen without judgment. After breakfast, she unzipped her damp bag, carefully drawing out her treasures, notebooks, the rabbit, and a small tin box with chipped paint. She opened it with reverence, revealing coins, a few bills, even buttons that carried no value but seemed sacred to her. She said it was her savings, meant for a gift to make her mother smile again. Alexander's chest swelled with both sorrow and admiration. This child, who had known scarcity, still dreamed of giving. He reached across the counter, his hand resting near the tin, and told her she already gave her mother something greater, herself. Her eyes shimmered, tears gathering, but she blinked them away, shoulders straightening with quiet pride. Later, as sunlight stretched across the dining table, she pulled from her bag a folded photograph, its edges frayed, colors faded but not forgotten. She held it close, as though it were her most precious possession. It was an image of a modest brick apartment building, its windows catching the glow of a happier time. Alexander froze. He knew that building. He had designed it years ago, his first major project, celebrated in newspapers and praised for its profit margins. To him it had been a triumph. To her, it had once been home. Their eyes met across the table, the photograph trembling in her hands, and in that instant the invisible thread between them tightened into something undeniable. She told him how her mother had cried when they lost that place, how she had promised her daughter they would find another home just as safe, though the promise had never been fulfilled. She said she kept the photo to remember belonging, to hold on to what love once looked like within walls. Alexander's heart cracked open. For years he had built structures without ever touching their stories, but now he saw the human cost etched into her tears. He reached for her hand, not to take the photograph, but to let her know she was not alone in holding its weight. In that quiet, filled only by the ticking of the clock and the faint hum of morning traffic, he realized the truth he had ignored for decades. A home is not granite or marble, not numbers in contracts, not profits sealed in ink. A home is the healing presence of safety, of love, of belonging. And as she leaned into the silence with him, clutching her rabbit and the photo, Alexander knew his life's work had been incomplete until this very moment. The day stretched on, carrying them gently into an afternoon where laughter stirred faintly between the walls. She traced her fingers along the bookshelves in his library, discovered forgotten stories in the children's section, and her lips curved into something almost playful as she read aloud softly. He stood in the doorway, watching, feeling his fortress transform into a place of warmth. Later, they prepared a simple meal together, grilled cheese and soup, clumsy yet perfect, shared at a counter that had never known companionship. And when she asked if he grew lonely in such a vast house, he admitted the truth. Her answer was soft, almost a whisper. "Me too." That night, as he watched her drift into sleep again, the photograph resting on her nightstand, he understood that destiny had knocked on his door, not in the form of business, not in accolades, but in the fragile figure of a young woman seeking only shelter. She had asked for a garage, but in giving her a room, he had discovered a deeper gift, the chance to heal the emptiness inside himself. The storm had passed, the night was clear, and yet Alexander felt the greater weather stirring within, the beginning of a bond that neither silence nor time could undo. The house no longer waited for echoes. It listened now, alive with the promise of healing and the warmth of something that felt at last like love waiting to be born. Afternoon sunlight poured across the high windows, gilding the marble with a glow that made the house feel less like a monument and more like a place where breath and memory could linger. Alexander had walked those halls countless times, always aware of their emptiness, but now each step carried a new sound. Her footsteps light as whispers, the faint hum of her voice when she thought herself alone, the scratch of her pencil across worn pages. The mansion, once a hollow echo, had begun to breathe with her presence. He found her in the library, a blanket draped over her shoulders, curled into a chair far too large for her, her lips moving silently as she traced words with her finger. The children's books he had bought long ago for visitors who never came lay scattered around her like pieces of a forgotten promise. She looked up when he entered, her eyes bright with something almost childlike, though framed with shadows of a life that had forced her to grow too soon. He stood there longer than he meant to, struck by the sight of someone who belonged so naturally to a place he had always believed belonged to no one. They made supper together, a simple affair, bread buttered with clumsy strokes, soup simmering with the scent of tomatoes, the air filling with warmth more nourishing than the meal itself. She laid cheese slices with careful precision, as though she were building something sacred brick by brick. He watched her move about the kitchen, small hands steadying themselves on counters gleaming with decades of neglect. And he realized it was not the meal, but the ritual, the gentle companionship of it that carved through the silence. When she bit into the sandwich, closing her eyes with a soft hum of contentment, Alexander felt his own chest ease, as if healing could arrive in the shape of melted cheese and shared laughter. At the counter, she spoke of nights when loneliness pressed too heavy, when she cried into her pillow, but tried to hide the sound so her mother would not feel the burden. Her voice was steady, almost defiant, yet the glimmer in her eyes betrayed the weight of carrying such silence alone. Alexander's throat tightened. He had hidden his own loneliness behind glass towers and marble halls, convincing himself that wealth was armor, that solitude was choice. But now he saw how the absence of love hollowed a life no matter the walls that contained it. He told her softly she was stronger than many grown men he knew, but that strength was not meant to be born without care. She listened, her eyes searching his face, perhaps unsure if promises could be trusted, but something softened in her shoulders, as though the words offered a healing she had not dared to expect. As twilight bled into evening, they walked outside together. The air was fresh, the grass damp beneath their shoes, the garden alive with scents he had long ceased to notice. She wandered toward the fountain, her hand brushing across the stone rim, her eyes alight with curiosity. She bent to pick up a fallen leaf, twirling it between her fingers as if it were a treasure. He stood a few steps away, hands in his pockets, and realized he had lived on this land for years, yet never once felt its simple beauty until she walked it. When she turned and asked if he ever played there, he chuckled softly, admitting he never had. "You should," she said, with a frankness that disarmed him. "It feels nice." The words lingered long after they returned inside, healing in their simplicity. At dinner, they sat at the long dining table, a table that had once been a cold display of wealth, but now bore plates touched by hands that cared. She swung her legs beneath the chair, her rabbit propped beside her, as if another guest. Alexander watched her eat, and the sight filled the space with a warmth he could not have bought with any fortune. Afterward, when she yawned and rubbed her eyes, he guided her to the guest room, pulled the blankets around her shoulders, and she whispered into the quiet, "Thank you for seeing me." He stood there long after her breathing steadied, his chest aching with the truth of her words. Later, alone in his study, he stared at the glow of his computer screen, messages piling from assistants and investors, numbers demanding attention. yet none of it seemed urgent, none of it alive. His mind returned again and again to the girl who had asked for a garage, but brought him a mirror of his own emptiness. He stepped into his bedroom, caught his reflection in the mirror, and for the first time did not see power or success, but a man weathered by years of solitude, his eyes hollowed by victories that had cost too much. The mansion, the art, the wealth, they were fragments of a life incomplete. And then he remembered the way she smiled when sipping cocoa, the way she whispered thank you with such sincerity, the way she filled silence with presence. Something in him shifted, the weight of a decision forming like dawn pressing against the horizon. Before sleep, he peeked into the guest room once more. She lay curled beneath the quilt, rabbit tucked close, the photograph resting on the nightstand, her breathing deep and even. He lingered, the quiet settling over him like a balm. The emptiness he had carried for years was still there, but now it felt altered, as though something fragile yet radiant had been placed within it. For the first time, silence was not an enemy. It was simply waiting, holding the healing possibility of love and belonging. The next morning arrived with gentle clarity. She sat at the dining table, her notebook spread before her, sketching a small house with crooked windows, flowers along the sill, a stick figure beside a taller one, their hands touching. She showed it to him shyly, and he felt his chest tighten at the innocence and the longing traced in pencil lines. "It's where we used to live," she whispered. "Not exactly, but how it felt." He told her it was beautiful, and she smiled faintly, then lowered her head again, clutching the notebook as if afraid the memory might fade. In that moment, Alexander knew he had been given more than a guest at his door. He had been given a chance to reclaim something he had lost. The truth that walls mean nothing without love to fill them, that wealth is hollow without laughter, that healing begins not with grandeur, but with the simple act of opening a door. And as the sunlight poured across the table, warming her bent head and his weathered hands, he understood with quiet certainty that life had shifted forever. What had begun with rain and a timid knock had become a story neither marble nor silence could contain, a story pulling them both gently toward a future waiting just beyond the horizon. The city lay just beyond the manicured hedges, alive with noise and motion, yet within the mansion a fragile stillness grew, no longer hollow but tender. Alexander had risen that morning with an unease he could not name. Business awaited him, messages on his phone, urgent calls flashing across screens, but every vibration felt like a ghost, an echo of a world that no longer commanded his heart. His eyes lingered instead on the young woman bent over her notebook at the dining table, sketching a crooked little house with windows framed by flowers and smoke curling gently from the chimney. She held her pencil as if it were a thread sewing memory to hope. He watched her without speaking, struck by how natural she looked in a room once suffocated by emptiness. Her hair fell forward in soft tangles, her lips pressed together with concentration, her rabbit propped loyally at her side. The scene was disarmingly ordinary, yet to Alexander it felt extraordinary. An act of quiet healing unfolding in the very halls that had long refused to harbour life. He realized, with a weight that steadied rather than crushed, that something had to change. The life he had built in steel and marble had never given him this, a sense of belonging, born not of ownership, but of presence. When she lifted her head, her eyes carrying that searching softness, She asked if he was going to work. He hesitated, the truth settling between them. "Not today," he answered. She frowned slightly, surprised, and asked if people would be angry. He smiled faintly and told her some things were more important than work. The words hung in the air, fragile yet firm, and though she bent back over her drawing, her shoulders seemed lighter, as if those simple syllables offered her a healing she had long craved, the knowledge that someone might choose her presence over duty. By midday, the decision inside him had crystallized. He could no longer ignore the weight she carried, the fear stitched into her stories, the way she clutched her rabbit as if bracing against the world's indifference. He knew that the healing she needed could not come from one night's shelter or one meal shared. It required something deeper, something lasting. He told her gently they would go see her mother. She froze, her pencil slipping, disbelief flickering across her face. "Really?" she whispered. He crouched beside her, meeting her gaze, and said her mother should not bear everything alone. The words were quiet, but they held the force of a vow. The drive into the city was unlike any Alexander had ever taken. He had passed these streets 1,000 times, usually behind tinted glass, the world reduced to blur. Now he drove slowly, watching her press her forehead against the window, pointing out small shops, cracked sidewalks, corners heavy with memory. Her voice grew quieter as they approached a squat brick building with peeling paint. "That's the shelter," she murmured. The sight of it tightened something deep in his chest. The tired faces smoking outside, the air heavy with resignation. For years he had considered such places abstractions, distant realities softened by donations and press photos. But here was the truth. This had been her world, the place where she had tried to sleep, where laughter had been replaced by shouts, where safety was a memory rather than a presence. They continued on until they reached the diner. Neon letters flickered above the door, the hum of conversations spilling out each time it opened. Inside, the air smelled of grease and coffee, a rhythm of clattering dishes and hurried footsteps. And there, moving between tables with a tray balanced carefully in her hands, was the woman Alexander recognized instantly. The same eyes as the girl, shadowed now with exhaustion, hair pulled back too tightly, uniform faded with too many shifts. When the girl whispered, "Mom," the tray nearly fell from her mother's hands. She turned, eyes widening, and then the diner dissolved around them as the child rushed forward, nearly stumbling, arms flung into her mother's embrace. The reunion was raw, a flood of tears and whispered apologies, her mother clutching her as though anchoring her soul against disappearance. Alexander stood back, uncertain, his heart pierced by the sight. He had witnessed deals worth millions, contracts signed in celebratory champagne, but never had he seen anything so pure as the way this woman held her daughter, trembling with relief. The girl confessed she hadn't wanted to be a bother, that the storm had driven her to seek shelter. Her mother hushed her with desperate tenderness, assuring her she could never be a burden. When the woman's eyes lifted to Alexander, suspicion mingled with gratitude, protective instinct bracing against the presence of a stranger. He cleared his throat and explained quietly. Her daughter had knocked on his door asking for a garage, and he could not let her stand in the storm. At his words, her mother's face crumpled, shame and thanks colliding in her expression. She apologized, explaining the endless shifts, the exhaustion, the fear of never providing enough. Alexander shook his head gently, telling her no child should believe they belonged in a garage. The moment stretched. heavy with truths unspoken. Around them the diner seemed to pause, even the clatter of plates dimming. Alexander realized he could not step back now. This was not about charity or guilt. It was about responsibility, about healing the wound of indifference he had carried too long. He told them he wanted to help, not with promises that dissolved, but with something real. Her mother's eyes narrowed, cautious, as if she had heard such words before, only to be left abandoned. But Alexander's voice carried a steadiness she could not ignore. "I am not leaving," he said. The words settled between them like stone, firm and unyielding. He explained his life's work, the towers, the complexes, the buildings meant for families, and how one of those very places had once been their home. He confessed he had never considered the human cost of raising rents, of chasing profits. Her mother listened, disbelief flickering, but when he offered what he had already decided, an empty apartment, furnished and safe, theirs without condition, her hand flew to her mouth. Tears welled as she whispered, "It was too much." "It's not enough," he countered softly. "But it's a beginning." The girl's eyes widened, her voice trembling. "Can we really have a home again?" Her mother's arms tightened around her, unsure, afraid to believe. Alexander met her gaze, his own steady, and said yes. That afternoon, from the booth of the diner, he made the call, instructing his office to prepare a unit immediately, stocked with food, child-friendly, ready by nightfall. His assistant stammered in confusion, but Alexander's tone left no space for hesitation. The decision had been made. When they arrived hours later, the building stood bright and clean, not grand like his mansion, but alive with the sense of community. Neighbors greeting one another, gardens blooming, windows glowing with soft light. The unit he had chosen was modest yet warm, its walls freshly painted, its small bedroom prepared with a quilt folded neatly, pencils arranged in a jar, and a lamp shaped like a star. The girl ran into the room, laughter spilling from her like sunlight. She pressed her hands against the bed, then hugged the pillow as if it were the rarest treasure. "It feels like it's mine," she whispered. Her mother stood in the doorway, tears streaming silently, while Alexander placed the keys in her hand. "You owe me nothing," he said quietly. "This is your home now." She shook her head, her voice breaking. "Why are you doing this?" He looked at her, then at the child twirling in her new room, and answered with the truth. "Because she asked if she could sleep in my garage, and no child should ever have to ask that." The words hung in the air, steady as a vow, and as the girl's laughter echoed through the modest apartment, Alexander felt something inside him release. The emptiness he had carried for decades gave way to a fullness not measured in wealth, but in healing presence. The night fell gently, the sky painted in strokes of gold and rose, and within those walls a new beginning stirred, fragile, tender, yet undeniably alive. And as he stood by the window, listening to the sound of the girl humming softly as she arranged her rabbit on the bed, Alexander knew the storm had brought more than rain. It had brought him the chance to rediscover what home truly meant. And in that discovery lay the promise of a love that could heal both her broken nights and his long years of silence. Evening settled over the apartment like a blessing, the kind of quiet that wrapped itself around the walls, not as emptiness, but as comfort. The girl sat cross-legged on her new bed, Rabbit tucked under one arm, tracing her fingers over the quilt, as if committing each thread to memory. Her mother moved gently through the kitchen, unpacking groceries, still caught between disbelief and relief. Alexander stood by the window, watching the city lights awaken one by one, and felt a peace he had never known in all his years of marble foyers and glass towers. After dinner, pasta and warm bread shared around a table too small to carry loneliness, she curled beside him on the couch, Rabbit pressed close, eyes serious. She asked if she could tell him something, but begged that he not repeat it to her mother. Her voice shook as she confessed nights spent waiting by the window for her mother to return from shifts that stretched too late. Once, she whispered, her mother had fainted at work and been taken to a hospital, and no one told her until the next day. She thought she had been left alone forever. Her tears caught in her lashes, her small hands trembling as she spoke, and Alexander's heart clenched at the thought of a child carrying such fear in silence. He told her she would never have to feel invisible again, that her presence mattered more than she could imagine. His words were steady, healing in their conviction, and she leaned against him, resting her head on his chest as if anchoring herself there. For a moment he froze, startled by the trust of that embrace, then slowly wrapped his arms around her, holding her with a gentleness that felt like rediscovering something sacred. Her breathing softened, and he realized she had given him a gift rarer than any fortune, faith in his promise. Later, when she drifted into sleep, he joined her mother in the kitchen. She was stacking dishes, her face weary yet tender, and when she looked up, she seemed to already know her daughter had spoken. Her voice broke as she admitted fear of failing, of carrying too much alone. Alexander shook his head firmly, telling her no one should carry such weight without help. His voice carried more than comfort. It carried resolve. He told her he wanted to stay, not for one night, not as a fleeting benefactor, but truly stay. Her eyes widened at the depth of his words, cautious but trembling with the hope that he might mean them. He explained that he had spent years building towers and empires, yet none of it mattered when measured against the simple truth of what he saw in her daughter's eyes. She studied him in silence, the hum of the refrigerator filling the space between them, and finally whispered that if he truly meant it, maybe they could give the girl the life she deserved. His throat tightened as he answered, "I do mean it, with everything I have." Morning came golden and gentle. The girl padded into the kitchen barefoot, hair mussed, Rabbit tucked beneath her arm. She climbed into a chair across from Alexander, rubbing her eyes, and asked if they had really slept there all night. He smiled and told her she would sleep there every night from now on. Her face lit with wonder, and she hugged her Rabbit tightly, whispering the brightest thank you he had ever heard. Her mother entered moments later, her uniform neat for another long shift, but there was a looseness in her shoulders, a relief that had not been there before. She poured coffee, sat down, and looked at Alexander with a mix of gratitude and disbelief, asking why he was still there. He answered simply that wealth meant little without someone to share it with, and that walls only became a home when filled with love. The girl's wide eyes shone with hope, her voice soft as she asked if that meant they were family now. The words landed between them like a benediction. Alexander swallowed the emotion rising in his chest and told her yes. If she wanted him, then family. She slid from her chair and wrapped her arms around him, her laughter bright, her heartbeat quick against his chest. In that embrace, he knew the truth. The mansion he had lived in all those years had never been home. But this small apartment, with its mismatched dishes and faint hum of daily life, now carried more warmth than all the estates he had ever built. Later that day, they walked together through the neighborhood. Children skipped rope on sidewalks, neighbors tended flowers, shopkeepers swept their doorways. She skipped ahead, her rabbit swinging in her hand, her hair catching the breeze, laughter trailing behind her like music. Her mother walked quietly beside Alexander, voice low, telling him he had changed everything. He shook his head gently and said it was the girl who had changed him. She had knocked on his door in the storm and reminded him what he had forgotten, that home was never stone or glass, but belonging. That night, as she settled into her new bed, she pulled the old photograph from her bag and set it on the nightstand, smoothing its worn edges. But this time she smiled at it, not with longing, but with gratitude, because she was no longer clinging to a memory. She was living a new one. Alexander tucked the blanket around her and kissed her forehead gently. "Sleep well," he whispered. Her eyes fluttered closed, and with a drowsy smile she murmured, "I like it when you say that." He turned off the lamp, his heart swelling with peace, and stepped back into the living room where her mother stood waiting. Quietly, she told him he had given them more than shelter. He had given them hope. He did not answer, because the truth was already alive in the stillness of the apartment, in the steady breathing of a child finally safe, in the warmth that now filled the space where emptiness had once ruled. For the rest of his life he would carry that storm-soaked night with him, the timid knock at the door, the whispered request for a garage, and the moment he realized the most important deal he would ever make would not be written on paper, but in the choice to open his heart. And that choice had become a love strong enough to heal them all. The days that followed unfolded like threads, weaving themselves into a tapestry neither of them had planned, yet both felt destined to hold. The apartment, once empty and waiting, quickly grew into something alive. Mornings carried the soft murmur of a child humming over her sketchbook, the smell of coffee rising from the kitchen, the shuffle of her mother preparing for another long shift. Evenings brought shared meals, stories halting at first, then flowing more freely, laughter slipping in like sunlight through a cracked window. The healing rhythm of ordinary life, once foreign to Alexander, became his anchor. He rose early, not to check markets or contracts, but to fry eggs the way she liked them, toast golden, orange juice poured with care. She sat swinging her legs at the counter, Rabbit perched loyally beside her, and he found himself memorizing the way her face softened as she ate, the way gratitude lived in every small smile. Her mother often paused in the doorway during these moments, her eyes carrying quiet astonishment at the gentleness that had replaced what once was fear. Alexander had built empires, but never before had he built mornings filled with such warmth. Afternoons, when her mother worked, he would sit with her at the table, watching as she sketched houses with crooked windows and flowers blooming in neat rows. Sometimes she drew stick figures, herself, her mother, and now, tentatively, another taller figure whose hand held theirs. The first time he saw it, his chest tightened with an ache both tender and overwhelming. She blushed when she noticed his eyes on the page, closing the notebook quickly, but not before he saw the quiet confession hidden in graphite lines. She had begun to imagine him as part of her family. They walked together through the neighborhood, stopping at shops where she pressed her nose to glass displays, eyes wide with wonder. She picked daisies from cracks in the pavement, twirled them in her fingers and tucked them behind her ear. He found himself noticing the world differently, not in terms of property values or square footage, but in the small beauties she revealed. The warmth of a baker waving from his shop, the sound of children's laughter bouncing between buildings, the way sunlight turned even chipped paint into gold. Healing had crept into his vision, softening edges he had thought permanent. One evening she tugged his sleeve and asked if they could have a movie night, the kind she used to have with her mother before life unraveled. They spread a blanket on the living room floor, bowls of popcorn between them, and she insisted he sit beside her. The film flickered on the screen, but what mattered was not the story being told there. It was the sight of her leaning into his side, drifting to sleep halfway through, her rabbit nestled between them. Her mother watched from the kitchen doorway, tears glistening in her eyes, and when their gazes met, Alexander felt the silent exchange of gratitude and trust. He tucked the blanket around the girl, carried her gently to bed, and realized with startling clarity that he had stepped into a role he had never dared to imagine, not benefactor, not guest, but protector, a man trusted with the heart of a child. Her mother began to speak more openly with him in the quiet of evenings after shifts. She told him of the years spent working 2, sometimes 3 jobs, of the exhaustion that gnawed at her bones, of the shame that came with not being able to shield her daughter from the world's hardness. Alexander listened, not as a businessman tallying costs, but as a man who had finally learned the currency of compassion. He assured her she was stronger than she believed, that survival was not failure, but proof of her love. She smiled at him then, weary yet soft, as though his words carried a healing weight she had longed to share. In time, the girl's laughter became a constant melody in the apartment. She filled walls with her sketches, leaving papers scattered on tables and taped to the refrigerator. She skipped down hallways, her rabbit dangling from one hand, her hair catching the light like a halo. Alexander found himself anticipating her every word, every question. Once, she asked him if marble floors ever felt cold under bare feet. He laughed, admitting they always had, and she grinned, declaring that rugs and laughter were better than stone. He realized she was right. Better than stone, better than glass, better than all the trophies of wealth was this, a home alive with small truths. Yet beneath the joy, he also felt the depth of his own transformation. He no longer saw himself as the man in the mansion, surrounded by silence and crystal chandeliers. He was a man seated at a modest table, holding a cup of coffee, while a child's voice filled the air, while her mother's tired yet contented smile anchored the room. He knew he could never return to the emptiness of before. Something within him had healed, but healing demanded permanence. One night, as they walked back from the corner shop, the girl held his hand without hesitation. Her fingers were small, warm, and unafraid, and the gesture pierced him more deeply than any contract ever had. She looked up at him, eyes shining in the glow of street lamps, and whispered, "I don't feel invisible anymore." His throat tightened, but he managed to smile, squeezing her hand gently, silently vowing she would never feel that way again. Back at the apartment, her mother set out tea, and the 3 of them sat together in the small living room, the quiet hum of the city beyond their walls. The girl sprawled on the floor, sketching another picture, this time of 3 figures beneath a roof, their hands joined, a star glowing above. She showed it proudly, and her mother looked at Alexander, emotion brimming in her gaze. For the first time, no words were needed. The picture said everything. Belonging had taken root. Night deepened, and when the girl drifted to bed, her rabbit tucked beside her, Alexander stood by the window with her mother. She whispered that she feared hope, feared the world's cruelty returning to tear this fragile piece away. He placed a hand lightly over hers on the windowsill and said quietly that he had no intention of leaving, that for the first time in his life he had found what he had been searching for. His words were not grand, but they carried the weight of truth, and she believed him. As dawn approached, Alexander realized the mansion no longer haunted his thoughts. It was just a building of stone, while here, in this modest apartment, love had built something immeasurable. Healing had woven itself into every breath, every shared glance, every gentle promise. He knew the story that began with a knock in the storm had become more than chance. It had become the foundation of a new life, and the beginning of a love that would only grow brighter with each passing day. The seasons turned, and what began as a fragile spark on a storm-driven night grew into a steady flame that warmed everything it touched. The apartment, once a place of transition, had become a true home, each corner infused with presence and care. Mornings were no longer solitary rituals but gentle beginnings. The sound of toast popping, the girl's humming while she braided daisies into her hair, her mother's soft laughter rising like sunlight through the windows. Alexander found himself memorizing these ordinary moments as though they were priceless treasures. Where once he had measured his days by profit margins, he now measured them by smiles, by drawings taped proudly to the refrigerator, by the quiet peace that filled the space where loneliness had once lived. He had begun to slow his world. Meetings that once dictated his every hour were rescheduled or passed along to others. Business still mattered, but not in the same consuming way. The company could build towers without his every breath. What it could not build was the life he was now nurturing. His priorities had shifted, gently but irrevocably. He poured his energy into presence, into learning what it meant to belong not to a boardroom, but to a family. Healing wove through each day like a soft thread, binding wounds both spoken and unspoken. The girl blossomed in ways that astonished him. At school, she began to draw less from shadows and more from light. She carried lunches packed with care, and when other children whispered cruel names, she held her head higher, steadied by the knowledge that she had a place to return to, a place where she was loved and seen. At home, her sketches grew larger, brighter, filled with gardens and skies, always with 3 figures beneath the roof instead of 2. Alexander noticed how naturally she added him now, not as an outsider, but as someone permanent. Each drawing felt like a vow, fragile yet undeniable. Her mother, too, changed. The exhaustion that had once carved deep lines into her face softened. There was still work, still long hours, but no longer the crushing weight of wondering where they would sleep or whether her daughter would eat. Relief replaced fear, and gratitude bloomed into something steadier, trust. She spoke more easily with Alexander, confiding hopes she had buried, laughing at small joys, leaning into the comfort of a presence that did not waver. He cherished those moments, the quiet evenings where tea steamed between them and silence carried ease instead of tension. Alexander himself felt reborn. For decades he had lived in rooms filled with echoes, convincing himself that solitude was strength. Now he realized that true strength came not from walls of stone, but from the vulnerability of opening one's heart. He marveled at how simple acts, tying a ribbon in the girl's hair, stirring cocoa on a cold night, walking hand in hand through the neighborhood, could fill the emptiness more completely than any tower of glass he had ever built. Love had arrived without grandeur, without design, and yet it had healed him more deeply than he knew he needed. The mansion still stood on the hill, a fortress of chandeliers and marble, but it no longer called to him. He visited less often, and when he did, the silence inside pressed heavier than before, a reminder of what he had escaped. It was not regret he felt, but clarity. Wealth had been his pursuit, but it had never been his answer. The true measure of his life was now found in the small apartment where laughter spilled across cracked walls, where a rabbit sat eternally loyal on a child's pillow, where drawings of crooked houses spoke louder than boardroom applause. One evening, as twilight stretched soft across the sky, they gathered on the balcony. The girl balanced on the edge, clutching her rabbit, pointing to clouds shaped like castles. Her mother leaned against the railing, eyes tired yet bright, her voice quiet with gratitude. Alexander stood between them, watching the horizon burn gold and rose, and realized that everything he had once chased paled compared to this. The storm that had brought her to his door had also brought him the life he had been unknowingly searching for. The girl looked up at him, her voice gentle but certain. "You feel like home." The words pierced him with sweetness, dissolving the last remnants of emptiness. He bent, brushing a kiss against her hair, and whispered that she was the one who had brought him home. Her mother reached for his hand then, and he took it, steady, unafraid. In that simple gesture, love was sealed. Not rushed, not forced, but grown patiently, like light spilling into the darkest corners until everything glowed. Night came softly, and the apartment settled into its healing rhythm. The girl drifted to sleep, her rabbit tucked close, a new drawing on her nightstand. This time, a garden with 3 figures holding hands beneath stars. Her breathing steadied, and Alexander stood watching her for a long while, overwhelmed by the quiet miracle of it all. He turned to find her mother beside him, eyes glistening, her hand resting lightly on his arm. No words were needed. The truth lived in the silence between them, radiant and full. As he lay down that night, he thought of the path that had led him here. The storm, the timid knock, the whispered request for a garage. He thought of how close he had come to closing the door, to remaining in emptiness forever. And he vowed never to forget that moment, never to forget that healing begins not with grandeur, but with the courage to open one's heart. He drifted into sleep with peace, knowing he was no longer alone. If this story touched your heart, let its warmth travel further. Leave a comment and share what healing means to you. Subscribe to stay close to more stories like this, where love rises quietly but powerfully. And if you felt even a flicker of light within these words, let it remind you to open your own doors, for sometimes the smallest knock can change everything.